Do you have a question, Joanne? Or
For Trish, can you hear me? I guess maybe I'm just not going close.
To clarify,
Okay.
clarify on the names, we have Trish here and Patty here.
Yeah, no, Trish. You said, I have two questions, but I'll wait for my second question to see how many other people had. The food patterns, the USDA food patterns, are based on a typical American food choices. Minus, of course, that you take out the fat and you take out the sugar, which is not a typical American diet at all. But if you did go back to the typical American diet, even independent of the fact that you take those two things out, I don't think anybody would say, in this room anyway, the nutritionist would say that's the optimal diet, right? But then you also said, well, this could change. But I'm really interested to know how you think it could change. And let me just give you one example. I mean, I know the things that came up in the 2005, but when it goes back to your modeling, again, to see whether it meets the DRI values, et cetera, things like whole grains versus grains, right? You can't do all grains because, all whole grains because they're enriched, and then you wouldn't be getting your B vitamins. Now, that sort of like is a stopping point right there. If somebody wanted to say, well, maybe it would be three servings of carbohydrates would be a good idea. No, you can't do that because you won't meet your DRIs. So maybe you can help me out
Let
here.
me clarify the first part about how it's based on typical or on American food choices.
Yes.
It's based on that in the sense that the foods that are consumed within a food group, we look at the relative proportions consumed by Americans. So we look within the grain group, we look at the proportions of bread, of pasta, of cereals, all of the different grain foods. We look at those in proportion. Now, in terms of looking at actual amounts recommended, those vary widely from what Americans eat. We know that Americans do not eat enough vegetables, do not eat enough fruit. They do not eat enough whole grains, although they eat sufficient amounts of total grains. So let's just clarify how it's based on American food choices. It's not in the amounts eaten, but in the actual types of foods within each group that are selected. Okay? And so, I'm sorry, I was focused on that. Your second point, what you wanted me to answer about the modeling?
If there was a way that somebody came into the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which I don't see this happening, but hypothetically, and said, I'd like to start over again. I don't think this 6 servings is a good idea. We ought to have 3 servings of carbohydrates and change the whole thing around. How could, given your modeling that tries to meet all the DRI requirements, come in?
We can do that through modeling, and then we find out what are the unintended consequences, which in the case of only having 3 ounces of whole grains and no refined grains, we discovered was not sufficient. But that if you replaced all of the refined grains with whole grains and had actually 6 ounces of whole grains, as long as some of those were fortified, and in the case of many whole grain types like cereals, they are. So as long as some of those were fortified, you did not have any unintended consequence in terms of like folate or iron or anything like that. So we can model. That's where modeling really helps, is it says what happens if you do this big change or even little change. Yeah.
Sally, next.
Sally Morton, thank you for those 2 talks. My question is for both Patricias. Where does uncertainty come into your calculations? In the food pattern analysis, you showed us 2,346 calories, of whatever the number was, and there kind of wasn't a range of uncertainty, but there must be some in that number. And in the modeling, there's a number of assumptions that go into this, not just about the parameter values, but how the whole thing. So how does uncertainty enter into your analyses? And furthermore, how do we convey it when we're trying to give these results to either the committee or to the public?
Do you want to start with that?
So that's a really good question, and I'm sorry that I rushed so much. I didn't really cover that. But that was kind of baked into the idea of the sensitivity analysis. So what you have is for each of the inputs into the model, you may not know what the certainty is of it. You can do things like test boundaries. Like, for example, let's just assume everybody quit smoking. Then what would happen to cardiovascular deaths? And if everybody quit, then there's no more. That's the end of your boundary. And you can only get that far in your endpoint, right? Or let's just assume that it wasn't effective at all. And that's what the base rates scenario shows you. If you had an intervention that didn't affect anybody, then what would happen? And then you know that you're somewhere between those boundaries. And oftentimes you can get a better guess than that, right? So for the example of smoking, you don't have to assume that every single person would quit. That's unrealistic, right? So let's just say we got down to our most ambitious. Let's just say we got down to, well, only 10% of the population smokes, right? Or something where the most effective intervention you had is going to last for the remainder of the time in the model. Those are the kind of things you can do, is use educated guesses and real boundaries of what's actually possible in real life to test what that uncertainty is and how much it's going to affect your outcome of interest. Does that make sense to you a little bit better? I think if I showed it to you with the way that you said, the second part of your question was, how do you communicate that? And what I've seen done with system dynamics modeling is having workshops where people sit down and actually get their hands on the software, and then what they can do is adjust the inputs themselves or the uncertainty themselves and see how it impacts the end. And it's sort of like these what-if scenarios, exactly what Tricia is talking about, except it's with a dashboard, and you can kind of move the levers yourself. They call them flight simulators or simulators. They're not dashboards. They're ways to sort of check out what would happen or what's expected to happen by modifying all of those things at the same time. And it's when you sit down and actually do that inputting yourself and look at how those trajectories change over time and try to unpack them that you really get a full appreciation of what the policy is going to do and how they work synergistically with other policies or they work against other policies.
Yes. Dr. Spoboda.
I'm sorry. Took all your time.
Thank you all. Those were really phenomenal discussions of, I don't want to say complicated because I'll insult system scientists by not using the word complex. Those were complex subjects to address in a short period of time. My question relates to what thoughts you may have on what kinds of things need to happen upstream so that processes like the DGAs have a richer repository of data and evidence to work with. Because to a certain extent, we're working with data and evidence that exists. And that data and evidence was generated because some things happened upstream that stimulated that research, that data and evidence to be collected and performed. And as we sit here today, we know at one level that we've got lots of epidemiology, we've got lots of econometrics, and we have very little in the way of system science. So what has to happen upstream so that more of that occurs and that kind of data and evidence is available, at the DGAC level?
Well, I think this committee can put that in their recommendations, that there be more of that available, and then show that to the NIH. That's where I would go with it, but it's CDC as well and other funding agencies, because the truth is that the dollars stimulate, the funding dollars for research are going to stimulate people to go and get that kind of data. But I'm telling you, there's a lot of folks, even through NSF, that are doing these kind of methods and approaches, but they're sort of agnostic to topic. So what you got to do, and they're very interested in working in things like public health, but if DOD is the one that's coming out with the money, that's where they're going to go. So I think it's got to be able to be funded, and if they knew the interest was here, they would come.
Any?
I'd like to push back on the randomized trial being difficult concept. I mean, I do randomized trials all the time. I was just come back from Bissau where we're randomizing 1,000 kids. So I don't think they're as hard as the epidemiologists make out. And, you know, from my perspective, there's a lot of worries, you know, associated with using the epidata too incautiously. I mean, for example, obese people, which is my primary topic, typically underreport calories by about 50%. And the 50% of the calories they don't report are not the same as the calories that they do report. And the food frequency questionnaires typically accept all data where the record is at least 500 calories. And so if somebody consumes 2,000, they assume that that 500 is representative of the 1,500 that they don't tell you about. So I love the idea of system science, but I think working out ways to be really prudent in the use of this epidata is going to be important so that it's not like garbage in, garbage out principle.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Thanks for making that point. I love to make that point about garbage in, garbage out is even in there somewhere. System science can't save you from a lack of data, right? It can only help you see what data you have and how valuable it is and what data you need to get next and what the priority order is of that. As to the randomized controlled trials as an approach, I think we probably agree more than we disagree. I probably made the overstatement a bit about that. I think what the point is that it shouldn't be, if it's used exclusively, it'll exclude out a bunch of other data. Does that make sense? In other words, if it's the one that gets the gold standard, then you won't be able to see that there's other types of evidence available. And so if you look and try to converge across things, the other thing is the time and expense to collect that kind of data when we're drowning in other types of data. So, you know, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it. I'm a believer and inclusive of all kinds of methods, and there's great value in the randomized controlled trial. I should not have made it seem like it was not valuable. It's just that it's only one piece, and it cannot do everything. It's just not meant to. Neither can system science. No method can do it all. That's why you need to bring them all to bear.
Thank you. Yes, James. Dr. Ard.
Jamie Ard. So I'm wondering, in relation to the scope of our task for the committee, in thinking about the composition of the DGAC and some of the things that we're hearing about the complexity of guidelines, and maybe that needs to be simplified, or maybe it needs to be more focused to help with really sort of getting the right expertise on the committee. But it sounds like the food pattern modeling has become sort of a perfunctory function that sort of we can call that up just like we call up the NEL to answer these particular questions. Should we be thinking about system science as a function that is just a part of the consultant group that the DGAC calls up? Because this is only going to get more complex. We're like, even if we focus the scope and we talk about birth to 24, you still got, all of those systems involved in that. So I'd like to hear your thoughts about maybe including some team or persons that are just like, Trish is, called up and says, we have this particular question, and they're part of that process.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a great idea in theory. What I'm worried about is in practice. I think it takes the modeling folks, because they come from such a different background, it is a time period that people need to cross the disciplines and communicate across the disciplines, and it takes a while. The other thing is you don't have the built-in infrastructure at USDA or AHRQ or anywhere else that at the Academies or anywhere that has like a team that's sort of like formed and ready to go to pounce, right? So I think it's a good idea, but it might take some time. It might also take some experimentation to figure it out. But I have no doubt that these folks have a wide range. System science covers a wide range of methodologies, and I was only able to come up with what I came up with in my slide deck, but there's probably far more things that could be done well beyond that. So I think, yes, it would be a good idea to start out small, bring some in, see what they can provide for the next set of guidelines, and then think about long-term building some sort of stable or some go-to group. Maybe one way to start it would be with what Patricia mentioned, I think a workshop of some sort. Mm-hmm. And maybe you could have a workshop where you get a panel of systems scientists, and I'd be happy to recommend some, who could come in and talk with the committee and get them kind of at the point where they aren't necessarily going to be modelers, but they'll be able to consume modeling information. They'll be good consumers of that kind of approach. And maybe that's one place to start.
I'd just like to add, in thinking about the process over time, before 2005, we didn't have food pattern modeling. Before 2010, we didn't have the Nutrition Evidence Library. And I think it is our job to constantly be thinking about what's next. And in fact, we have some on our team who are here who keep asking those questions. What's next? What do we need to be thinking about as we move forward, and how do we build that infrastructure? And so I think this is a real area that we need to be thinking about, and would obviously welcome your recommendations around how to think about this piece.
Dr. Lepton, did you have another question?
Another for the other Trish, Patricia Britton. You had a slide right off in the beginning, and you showed all of these things coming from whatever it was back then, telling us what to eat that's available. And then it was the pyramids and 2 different kinds of pyramids, and then it's MyPlate. And you said something, and maybe I heard it wrong, that's not really connected to the dietary guidelines and the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. But that's what, like, all my students and everybody else, they get online, and that's what they say. I'm supposed to be eating this, this, and this. So is there a disconnect between that final part?
No, they're not synonymous, is what I was trying to say. Is that if you talk about MyPlate, MyPlate is an image that comes from trying to give a pictorial representation of some elements of the USDA food patterns, but it clearly does not provide all the nuance and detail and quantitative information that's available in them. You can't show that in a pictorial representation, so it kind of comes oh yeah, I should eat more, more vegetables or whatever. But they're not synonymous, and I think that people have assumed, especially in the era of the original pyramid, they assumed they were synonymous. And so what I was trying to do is just remind people that there are these quantitative patterns that can be represented by a picture, but they are more complex and more detailed than any picture could ever show.
But if you, let's say you have nutrition students, and they get online and they go onto myplate.gov, and then and they put in their weight and whatever, and it tells them what to eat. So
that's the patterns. That is the patterns.
Okay, so that goes back to
there's not a disconnect there.
Okay, but the patterns don't necessarily go back to the...
Well, the patterns, as I said, are a lot more complex than just MyPlate. Yeah, they're not the pictures are not quantitative. The pictures do not differentiate between various age groups or various calorie needs. So I just wanted to make the point that they're related, but they're not exactly the same.
All right, Dr. Seaman, this is the last question.
Okay, thanks. This has been a great discussion, and my question is for you, Trish. So I know you said that you don't use menu modeling, and you use this primarily to look at what if, but in the process in 2010 and 2015, didn't you effectively use this to make the recommendation on SOFAs, on the solid fats, added sugars, or that the committee then used this information to create some numeric recommendations? Am I interpreting
Yes,
that
I was
correct?
just differentiating it from menu modeling, which usually uses one specific set of foods, and they change a specific food. What we do is we can change various elements of the pattern, and we could, increase one particular food or one particular food group, or decrease or change the composition of that by eliminating certain parts of it, like with a vegetarian pattern. But the menu modeling to me is using specific foods, whereas our food pattern modeling, we are using this broad range of foods. So if you're looking at recommendations in the fruit group, for example, that fruit group recommendation is based on the knowledge of the nutrient composition and the proportional consumption of over 100 fruits. So, you don't just have, the most common fruits are apples and bananas and oranges, so we'll use those and model what fruit intake looks like. We have 100 fruits that their nutritional values are put in I hate when I can't come up with the word I want. Anyway, in a proportional way, based on their consumption, those nutrient values become the amount of nutrients in the fruit in general.
Right. I think my question was more, didn't you use that sort of pattern analysis that then led to specific recommendations on the amount of calories from sofas?
Well, yes, in terms of, that did go into the guidelines in terms of, in these patterns, these are the limits. Yeah, but it was all referenced to in the USDA patterns, those are the limits, yeah.
Thank you. I'd like to thank our two Patricia's speakers this afternoon. Thank you very much. We have a 10-minute break now.